Hello and welcome back to the FrameLab podcast. I'm Gil Duran. If Donald Trump wins the 2024 election, tech moguls like Elon Musk will capture an unprecedented amount of power. Trump has even suggested making Musk the head of a government efficiency department. This would give the tech billionaire, the richest man in the world, the power to defund or punish the very government agencies that currently regulate his businesses. But even if Trump loses, democracy still faces a big threat from tech companies. That's because governments around the world, including in the United States, have become increasingly dependent on these companies. In fact, major government functions and responsibilities have now been outsourced to tech. This funnels billions of dollars to these companies, increasing their already massive wealth, but it also gives these Silicon Valley companies and their leaders significant authority over the rest of us. Today, power that once belonged to governments now belongs to private companies. For example, the United States has basically outsourced its space program to Elon Musk's SpaceX, and it relies on Musk's Starlink to provide access to the internet in hard-to-reach places like the battlefields of Ukraine. The U.S. also increasingly relies on companies like Anduril, Google, Microsoft, and Palantir to carry out basic functions of the government, the military, and law enforcement. These companies have amassed so much power that governments around the world are increasingly hesitant to challenge them. And this poses a huge threat to democracies and human rights around the globe. In a new book called The Tech Coup, How to Save Democracy from Silicon Valley, Marietje Schaake lays out the problem and shares a list of possible solutions. Schaake is a former member of European Parliament who now teaches at Stanford University, and she studied the work of Dr. George Lakoff, and she deliberately frames this problem as the tech coup. In the introduction to The Tech Coup, Schaake writes the following, quote, Democratic governments willfully enabled the unmitigated growth of the market in digital technologies. They did not take this approach in secret. In fact, public and private leaders in many corners of society seemingly cheered on government's regulatory inaction. A cascading set of society's leaders helped us arrive at our sad reality. Early tech pioneers crafted a libertarian ideological foundation the burgeoning industry could embrace. Later tech executives transformed that ideology into anti-regulatory corporate practices and built companies that sought to become governments of their own. Even as tech growth skyrocketed, Democratic and Republican administrations in the United States refused to put checks in place to balance companies' power or behavior and to hold them to account when needed. Along the way, a rotating cast of operatives moving between public office and industry sustained this hands-off approach. Analyzing the role that each of these groups played in trumpeting a laissez-faire business approach to regulation gives us a better grasp of how tech companies became so powerful at the cost of our democracies. End quote. Here's my talk with Marietje Schaake, the author of The Tech Coup, How to Save Democracies from Silicon Valley. Marietje Schaake, thanks for joining me, and thanks for writing this book.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure.
I read most of it during a long plane flight and was highlighting sentences and paragraphs on almost every page because it's a scary book, because the tech coup that you identify as a serious problem. But I think it's also a hopeful book because you think there's still time for citizens of democracy to do something about it. So before we get started and get into the book more, let's give listeners a sense of who you are. What's your background and how did you come to the subject of the tech coup?
Well, I'm really happy you saw both the sense of urgency and the hopeful perspective. That's exactly what I wanted to convey. And I came to writing this book from, on the one hand, having served as a member of European Parliament in the EU between 2009 and 2019, a decade in time during which the anticipation of what tech might bring changed dramatically from being very hopeful, actually. Think about Barack Obama's campaign, the expectations of what technology would mean for people rising up against dictatorships in the Middle East and elsewhere, to a place of much more concern, of monopolistic behavior, of a power grab by tech companies that was not used to facilitate the advancement of human rights or the rule of law or democracy. And so that was one part of my experience that really informs this book. But after stepping down from the European Parliament, I was asked by a number of governments, regulatory agencies, multilateral organizations from my new position at Stanford to think with them about policy questions, which, of course, is something that I'm happy to do. But I found myself repeating similar points over and over again. And I felt like it was hindering a focus on solutions because, if you talk for 1 or 2 hours or even 1 or 2 days, you can get a sense of the challenges, but then when time is up, no time left for solutions. So I wanted to create a starting point of a diagnosis of a systemic problem that comes from the outsized power of tech companies and how that hurts democracy and the rule of law. And focus on that systemic nature more than on the various, what I think of as incidents or symptoms of the problem that have also clouded the policy and the solution space. Because, for example, take the question of content moderation on social media platforms, a very important question, but also one that's been basically stuck for about a decade. And if we change the perspective slightly to look at questions of legitimacy, why would companies have such decision-making power at all? Where does transparency and independent oversight and accountability come from? Then we can hopefully tackle a number of problems in one go. So that was roughly where I came from and the goal with the book.
The main thesis of the book centers around the fact that governments all over the world have allowed tech companies to amass this massive amount of power, largely by outsourcing major government duties to private corporations. You refer to this as an abdication of government's responsibility. Why has this happened? And how does what's happening with our governments and with these tech companies differ from previous partnerships in other eras where government has worked with the private sector to create new products and technologies?
So my lens is mostly on democratic governments and why they have not stepped up to create a more comprehensive governance framework around technology, why they have not appreciated the power dynamics of the impact of technology throughout our societies, whether we think about national security or civil liberties or the public debate or economic affairs. There are so many aspects of digitization that it would make sense for governments to stake out a much more values-based role to make sure that there are checks and balances and to make sure that technology is used in a way that enhances their beliefs and their objectives rather than operating in parallel and sometimes against government objectives, democratic objectives. So why this has happened, I think, has many reasons. We need to particularly look at the United States, where on the one hand, there are so many of the main tech companies operating or housed there, based there. And on the other hand, the US government has had an incredible trust in what market forces would lead to, leaving these technologies to just operate on the basis of what companies see fit without putting up guardrails or checks and balances has really been sort of the American model.
Well, in many ways, the government has traditionally worked with private companies to develop certain things. I'm thinking of like Dow Chemical or Boeing or Lockheed Martin. So there's always been sort of a symbiotic relationship between certain aspects of corporate America and the government. But it seems like what you say is that a lot of what the government has done in recent years is abdicate and really outsource some major and powerful duties to private companies that have not only become rich through this, but have gained an increasingly uncomfortable amount of power in democratic societies and in authoritarian governments you also write about as well. Is there something specific about the way digital works that has made this power even more entrenched and all-encompassing than in previous eras?
Yes, I do believe so, because the way democratic governments have allowed themselves to be very dependent on tech products and services, as you sketched, they've outsourced a lot of their own functions, but they've also neglected to regulate, so to put up guardrails. And it's that combination really that has led to a leaking of power out of the hands of our democratically elected and accountable leaders and their institutions into the hands of companies. And tech is different because it touches on so many parts of our lives. It's really a layer over everything these days rather than a sector or a product or a service. And on top of that, the way in which business models of tech companies work changes all the time and is highly individualized. So think about our respective experiences with social media companies, search engines, retail platforms, AI services and models, where it's highly individualized. So from a regulatory point of view, it's really hard to know where a violation of the law has happened, because what you see is different from what I see. What I experienced today is different from what I experienced 3 weeks ago or will in 2 months. So the very fluid nature presents problems for the regulatory model as we know it. But with AI specifically, the fact that there's so much unpredictability that's intrinsic to the latest AI models presents another challenge, where even the people who build the AI applications say we don't know what's going to happen, and they're excited about this, unpredictable nature of these AI models. But from a societal point of view, from the perspective of how much risk are we willing to take in society, how can we ensure that people's rights are not violated, they're not discriminated against, or there are not already laws that we have being crossed by these technology companies. It's incredibly hard to apply oversight. So it's a combination of those factors, and outsized belief in market forces, the unique characteristics of business models and AI models in particular, but also a romanticized view of what technology would bring if it would just be left alone.
Definitely. That's a point you make a lot, and we've seen a lot of argument against even basic regulation, most recently with the fight over how to regulate AI in the United States. And AI is one sector that's important because it's increasingly everywhere. You can't even log into any program without some kind of AI interface popping up now, whether it's your email or even this podcast program I'm using wants to create an AI voice to read things so that I don't have to read them. It's just being incorporated into everything very quickly, even before we know what effect that will have. And you highlight some other major sectors where tech has started taking over government duties. These include space travel, satellite deployment, weapons development, especially drones and other kinds of programs, surveillance, cloud computing. What are the major danger points, and how does tech's control of these areas affect the average citizen? What should the average citizen be worried about, especially with, things like facial recognition and surveillance?
Right. So on the one hand, on the level of infrastructure and the whole question of conflict and hybrid warfare, we see that roles that used to be the monopoly of democratic states, think about building infrastructure or deciding on when to attack across borders, are now decisions that companies are making. Elon Musk is providing internet access through his Starlink internet services through satellites, but other companies like Google, AWS, Microsoft are laying undersea data cables to facilitate the internet traffic of their services. There's the development of data centers that has a deep impact on the use of electricity and water. And of course, licenses have to be obtained to build those data centers. But what companies do is they bid on them without revealing their true identity. And there's currently not a standard to measure, for example, electricity use, water use. So it's really difficult for lawmakers, often local city councilors, to know the implications of their decisions and to even know who is at the other side of the table, because big tech companies are actually hiding their identity when they're doing this bidding. So in a variety of ways, it has really put the state in an offside position, really outside of a lot of key decisions, and allows companies to develop critical technologies, critical services that they then have the insight into, they have the governance over, while bigger questions of, let's say, geopolitical conflict where undersea cables would be targeted or where satellite information becomes critical, such as in Ukraine, the decision-making power by a company or a CEO, let's take Elon Musk as an example, really has deep consequences.
Definitely. And you would think that these are some decisions that would be left up to governments. We all remember the situation in Ukraine where he made it so that Ukraine couldn't launch an offensive that they had been planning. So you have the CEO of a company who is making these kind of geopolitical strategic decisions that would normally be left to our elected leaders in Washington. And that seems like a very strange situation. But again, it seems like it's happening on multiple layers now because basically we've taken this infrastructure that should be public infrastructure, publicly owned, controlled through democratic means, and we have allowed it to become private infrastructure. And there will be consequences for that.
Absolutely. I think it's an incredibly consequential development that doesn't get the attention politically that it should. In the US, it's not much of an election topic. It wasn't much of an election topic during the European elections that we just had over the summer. It really does not get the attention and the priority that it deserves, because indeed the consequences of this outsourcing, of this privatization of key functions and governance decisions in our society does impact people, whether it's directly, in the case of citizens of Ukraine, or more indirectly, for example, in the fact that citizens cannot know what is happening in their name, with taxpayer money, or with conflicts that happen completely below the radar. The whole domain of cyber offense and defensive is happening in a legal gray zone, where on the one hand, companies are engaging in operations across borders, for example, to take out hacker networks or attackers on their services. But we will only know about it when they decide to communicate about it. We also see governments using the legal gray zone, or basically the legal vacuum, to engage in activities that are not happening according to a democratic mandate or democratic oversight. So this, in a case of people who believe in the rule of law and having this kind of mandate and oversight over the most consequential operations, is something that should concern citizens, even if it may not impact their daily lives.
And that's interesting because technology, even a few decades ago, was something that was supposed to increase our freedom and spread democracy. And the early ideas of the cypherpunk saw technology as a means to escape the grasp of repression or authoritarian governments. But that's not how things are working out. Authoritarian governments are also using technology very effectively to control, repress, and persecute their citizens. And major tech companies are happy to be complicit in such repression because they get money and to some degree power out of it. And in the book, you do talk about how authoritarian governments have become experts at using technologies to repress and persecute their populations. Can you walk us through some of those examples that you have in the book?
Yes. I mean, it's remarkable how cypherpunks understood how powerful these technologies were, and that the abuse of this power would lead to dire consequences for people's civil liberties, like the right to privacy, for example. And in a different way, but equally power focused, authoritarian governments have appreciated the impact of technologies and how they could instrumentalize it for more control, more surveillance, more repression. And by now, for example, the Communist Party's model in China is one of not only domestic repression and control, but also of a global agenda where they are rolling out a combined investment program in infrastructure. The uptake of Chinese-made surveillance tools in developing countries, for example. And indeed, you see that this authoritarian model is spreading also because it is clearly defined and rolled out globally, where democratic governments have failed to develop such a comprehensive package of measures, of foreign policy tools that combine economic, security, and rights-based challenges. And so that vacuum is really also used by authoritarian states to roll out their technologies and their models at the expense of the strength of democracy worldwide. So the whole question of how powerful technologies are, what is needed to make sure that they operate within the values that define our democratic societies is something that really needs to happen very, very quickly.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when I think back about the cypherpunks, but you also think before that, even George Orwell kind of had it right with Big Brother, right? An all encompassing surveillance system that we would sort of voluntarily, to some degree, um, in these days, we voluntarily have Big Brother. We're all under constant surveillance by our devices and our software apps. And so it's interesting the idea of technology being a tool for rebellion against authoritarian repression. And in the end, it turns out that the whole revolution has been about money and power and in many ways, the concentrations of power and wealth rather than a more equalized situation. It's a bit dystopian, I would say. I think
It's
back, you
very
use, yeah.
dystopian right now. It's very dystopian. And what I think is really, very damning is that US citizens, US politicians, US companies could have learned so many lessons from what happened around the world. You know, how social media platforms became platforms for drumming up violence and genocide, how the use of data can be used to target people, how the whole surveillance capitalism model is also a model to undermine trust in anything from the democratic process to public health measures like vaccines, that spyware can easily be used to track and trace opposition figures, lawyers, journalists, even in democracies, and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, we've had to see this dystopian reality unfold in the US before some people appreciated what the actual harms of unregulated technology really are.
Yeah, and you quote John Perry Barlow, and it's a quote I'm very familiar with now. He was, for those who don't know, was a lyricist for some Grateful Dead songs, was a cattle rancher, sort of came from a hippie background, but had a bit of a libertarian vision about Silicon Valley, and he issued something called the Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace in 1996, where he said, quote, governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. You have neither solicited nor received ours. We did not invite you. You do not know us, nor do you know our worlds. Cyberspace does not lie within your borders, end quote. And back then, I don't remember reading this back then, but I might have thought that was an interesting idea about independence, freedom, something in the more kind of leftist freedom frame. But it sounds very different now in 2024, given where Silicon Valley and technology has gone, as these corporations amass more power, become the big bullies in the room, and no longer seem like these kind of upstarts with long hair trying to fight for a different world. It's just a very, very different feeling. It makes me a little sad as someone who appreciates some of those Grateful Dead songs that John Perry Barlow wrote, that he's not here to kind of update this credo in relation to how right wing much of this stuff now seems.
Yes, but of course, those ideals were genuine and I think they could have materialized. But what has happened is that some of the big tech companies have kind of stolen that narrative and pretended that they were the ones building a decentralized, human rights enhancing, empowering, emancipating kind of internet. They've really literally framed their arguments as building the internet, while of course they were offering private services on the internet, which is something different if you look at their behavior. More monopolistic, more power and capital hungry, scaling rather than making principled decisions, integrating vertically to being sort of octopus type companies with so many tentacles in key parts of our society. And hoovering up all the data for a variety of goals, whether it's targeted advertising or developing new AI models. So these companies have become something that they were not, 15, 20 years ago, but those ideals were still sort of, repeated like mantras as if they defined Silicon Valley throughout. And I think that romantic view, which I agree with you, I'm nostalgic for as well. I think there was and still is enormous promise in connecting people, unlocking knowledge, making sure that unheard voices are more empowered. But it doesn't happen automatically, and it doesn't happen by trusting big companies to deliver. And I think that is the main, diagnosis in the tech coup.
Absolute power corrupts absolutely, and the same can be said for infinite money. So the money and the power have really changed what those original ideas were, and I think it's become something else. And speaking of money, money and power also changes politics, and tech companies have been able to resist regulations of many kinds here in the United States by investing heavily in political campaigns and lobbying, and also making use of the revolving door with former government officials from both parties leaving government to work directly for tech companies and then going back and forth. Um, are there any major differences between conservatives and liberals when it comes to challenging tech's quest for dominance? I'm thinking right now about how Kamala Harris has had to sort of kowtow to crypto because crypto is now spending the most amount of money as a PAC in the 2024 election. And so it does seem that to some degree, everybody wants to be on the side of tech and wants to like tech. And there is not much of a difference between the two parties in terms of how it approaches the regulation of tech and its kind of relationships with the entire sector.
I do think there are major differences, though I agree that it would be much better, and it's almost a litmus test for Kamala Harris to be more outspoken and bold in saying that this kind of abuse of power is unacceptable. It would really lean on her law and order pass that I think would be very helpful here, but she's walking a fine line. But if you look at the Biden administration, actually quite a bit has happened through executive orders, through the FTC, that was not possible through legislation because the Congress is so deeply divided. We will see, if Donald Trump were to win the elections, that there will be an enormous difference if the Republicans come to power through Donald Trump with the backing of these crypto entrepreneurs or charlatans, whichever way you want to look at it, with enormous VC money that is looking to deregulate the little regulation that is there. So I agree that there should have been much more action from both sides, and as I align myself more with progressive voices, I'm disappointed that progressive politicians in the U.S. have not done more and have not seen what was at stake, or have not been bold enough to step up, even if it may have been a less popular message from time to time. But now I think citizens expect politicians to step up and to do something to protect their children, to protect national security, to restore trust in society, and to make sure that there is transparency and accountability when there is discrimination or when billionaires are seeking to advance their own position. Because you made a very important point about capital. The narrative coming out of Silicon Valley is still one of we are here for innovation and unique ecosystems to foster that. But really, a number of tech companies are much more about capital than they are about innovation. In fact, you could argue that their monopolistic behavior is actually stifling innovation.
That's an interesting point you make, and it brings me to my next question about framing. Your book mentions the work of George Lakoff, who's the co-founder of this podcast, and you talk about how tech companies have successfully framed the situation as one in which any rules or regulations are viewed as negative or harmful. We hear stifling innovation a lot. Anything that tech doesn't like will stifle innovation, which apparently is a very bad thing for everybody. How successful have they been at framing the stakes?
Well, in the tech coup, I spent quite some time addressing the notion of framing, because the way we talk about technology also impacts the way we think about it, we debate it, and we develop policies around it. And tech companies have been remarkably successful, not only at lobbying and not only at selling us technologies, but also at framing our understanding of the impact of technology and the effects of regulation of it, for example. So I've really enjoyed reading George Lakoff's work about the power of framing, and looked at some of the examples that the tech sector has spun. So this notion of regulation stifles innovation is probably the most successful lobbying phrase that Silicon Valley has ever spread around. It's still being used to counter any regulatory proposal to curb the outsized power of tech by saying, oh, the internet is going to be regulated, while it's actually only a handful of companies that operate on the internet, or by suggesting that any guardrails to protect fundamental rights or to make sure there's more transparency or possibility of oversight actually is going to kill the goose with the golden eggs, the innovation that these companies bring. And so it has really hindered more forceful action on the part of lawmakers, because I think they were afraid to be, old-fashioned and against the waves of progress that technology would bring, and the innovations that were going to make the lives of people so much better, that we're going to solve. We hear this a lot in the context of AI, the world's thorniest problems like cancer or environmental harms that AI can find solutions for. So again, the enormous promise of what innovation, now AI, is going to bring is framed in a way that should discourage lawmakers from taking their responsibility, which is to make sure that there are deliberate processes by which technologies and innovations can be used in our society.
And in a way, it's an old trick that is often used in politics, the idea that something's going to kill jobs or hurt the economy, right? So anything you do that we don't like is going to kill jobs or hurt the economy or keep us from curing cancer or getting to Mars. And they've done a good job at that. I was thinking about, Kamala Harris and crypto. I give her a pass because she's in a tough campaign with a $200 million super PAC pointed at her head. And she doesn't really have a lot of options in terms of taking on crypto at this exact moment. And crypto has done a good job, in Washington at least, at framing its case as one of, we are helping to bank the unbanked and open up economic opportunity, et cetera, et cetera. When in reality, what that means is they're also stealing money from some of the poorest people in the country who can't even get bank accounts because they don't have the credit or the means to do so. And so it's hard to take that on and reframe it in a campaign where it's so tight. If she were 15 points ahead, I think she'd have to hit crypto. And I'm interested to see if she gets elected, what she actually does, because as you said, she is a former prosecutor and certainly knows the type of people who are mostly engaged in crypto these days. At the same time, you talk about how the tech companies have framed their own case to their own benefit, but you do a bit of framing of your own. You call this the tech coup. And that's some pretty strong and provocative framing. So can you give us a sense of why you chose that frame and why people should be concerned about this?
Yes, I'll come to that, but I do think, for example, the framing of crypto products as currencies is another very successful frame, because it really invokes notions of trust, of a predictable way in which these products are used in society, while of course they're highly speculative and they're not underwritten by central banks or monetary policies the way actual currencies are. But the reason why I chose the title "The Tech Coup" is because I want people to appreciate the power grab by tech companies as very political and as very consequential. And I want to encourage people to look at the problem through that lens of governance, of who has insight, who has agency, who makes decisions, who decides over our self-determination, and over whether there are processes of justice and accountability. And so, indeed, I'm hoping to invoke the notion of a power grab. But as you've pointed out, I'm not just looking to tech companies to criticize them for having taken up so much power. I'm certainly also criticizing democratic governments for allowing them to take up so much power. So it's really a situation where tech companies have basically taken the space that has been left open for them. And that's also why I think there's so much that can be done to change the equation, because there are so many common sense solutions that really haven't even been tried.
Definitely. And that's why your book is grim, but also hopeful. because you lay out possible solutions for stopping the tech coup. And I was trying to number them, but I think I wasn't able to do it in time. There were so many. I think that's good when you have so many solutions that are laid out in such an order that there's actual policies that can be pursued from those. So what are the main things that democratic government should do right now to halt this trajectory? You talk about renovating democracy's house, the precautionary principle, curbing anti-democratic technologies and practices. Give people a sense of what some of these things would mean and how they might change the equation here.
Yeah, so I am mainly focusing on solutions that will bring back the primacy of governance in the hands of democratically elected and accountable leaders and institutions. And a lot of the measures are about transparency and accountability. So I will not name just a couple. I'm happy to hear that you saw a number of them, even though I restricted myself. I could have offered more, but I wrote the Tech Coup to be a book that's accessible to the average newspaper reader and not just for policy wonks. But for example, I don't think companies should be able to bid on licenses anonymously. I think they should show their true identity, and that we need standards and metrics for resource use so that we can assess what is appropriate in our communities and what isn't when it comes to these major data centers that companies are seeking to build around the world. We need to also make sure there are measures that hold governments to account when they outsource their services through tech companies. So I talk about this notion of the public accountability extension, which means as much as when a government agency, let's take the tax authority, or let's take the Department of Education for that matter, when they engage tech companies to perform services for them, that should not allow them to shirk their own responsibility of providing freedom of information, answers when they're asked by journalists, or to allow for oversight by a parliament or a Congress when that is sought. And in reality, we do see that happening. There are police and law enforcement services who say, no, we don't hack the devices of suspects, but then they hire a company to do it for them. That sort of abdication of transparency should not be allowed either. So this is really a measure that impacts government's behavior. Then I look at ways in which, for example, legislatures can have more access to independent information. Like there's a legal service in most parliaments, like the Congress or the European Parliament. We need a tech expert service there too, so that the lobbying is not the only path of information provision to decision makers about how technology works, so that the corporates cannot frame our understanding of technology as successfully. So that's another sort of common sense step to take. But I also look at creating more time or friction between the release of the latest innovative technologies so that we can learn a bit more about their possible effects within society in the public interest. And so, all the measures are aimed at breaking the dependence, the stronghold of companies on our governance processes by unlocking more information in the public interest, which will hopefully facilitate a more fact-based policy debate and better policies and accountability mechanisms ultimately.
And you have some really specific stuff in there too, like banning the use of commercial spyware by government agencies, outlawing data brokerage where these data brokers sell our data, rethinking the use of facial recognition systems and banning those who violate the rules or laws, and banning cryptos that are not minted by licensed organizations. And you also mentioned that we should stop calling them currencies for the most part, because that's a framing that they are benefiting from and that they don't earn truly. So I think you have a lot in here that's very specific, and I hope someone who has a position of power will read the book and take some ideas away, because right now it seems that the tech companies are winning and the people are losing in this equation. And I think to your idea about the research service, one of the ways that tech often makes fun of legislators and politicians is by saying that they don't even understand the technology and don't know how anything works. And so I think that having some experts on staff to make sure everybody knows what's really going on as it's emerging and occurring would help to mitigate that particular criticism. And again, thank you for writing the book and helping to frame this up for us. And we at FrameLab really encourage anybody who's listening to go out and buy it and to read it and to tell your legislators and mayors and governors and everyone else to read it as well. Is there anything I didn't ask you that you think it's important to say before we end our conversation?
I think we've discussed a lot. I'm actually encouraged to see lawmakers and regulatory bodies contacting me after having read the book. So I do think in policy circles, the notion of them being empowered, offering ideas of how they can ensure that they have the primacy of governance again does really resonate. So I'm happy to see that. But I'm also happy to hear when I got an email yesterday from someone who reserved it in the library and was just excited to learn as an IT professional, what the darker sides of their profession were. So I'm getting a lot of feedback that is very encouraging, and I appreciate that we could talk about the tech coup today here as well.
That was my talk with Marietje Schaake, author of The Tech Coup, How to Save Democracy from Silicon Valley. It's out now in print and digital formats, and you can order it from your favorite bookstore.